Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, can I start my address in reply by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to all elders, past, present, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Gumbungia people on whose land I make my home on the New South Wales North Coast. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. Ginagay. Mr. President, I would like to again congratulate you on your election, and to all new and returning members, offer my congratulations on your election and ongoing role in this new Parliament. After 4 years in the political and literal wilderness, where I learnt so much, it is an incredible honour and privilege to have the opportunity to again serve the people of New South Wales in this place. Mr. President, I would like to begin by making some observations in relation to the upcoming bicentenary of this House, the New South Wales Legislative Council. Firstly, after 200 years of self-government on this continent, I believe it is now time for Australia to become a republic. The absurdity of our independent, multicultural, proudly democratic nation being tied to a redundant hereditary monarchy and prejudicial colonial past was never writ more large than during the recent coronation of King Charles III. What we witnessed from half a world away was the strange spectacle of a dysfunctional familial soap opera cloaked in self-aggrandising pomp, ceremony, and the stolen bling and baubles of a despotic and disappeared empire. It's time to move on. It's time for an Australian head of state. Secondly, it's time for a mature and just nation to support the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its process of voice, treaty and truth. I will be supporting and urge others to support the referendum question recognising our First Nations in the Constitution, thus ensuring a permanent forum for their representation. I believe we must tell the truth about our past and the truth about another shameful bicentenary, for this year, 2023, marks the bicentenary of the commencement of the genocidal wars waged upon the Aboriginal people of then Van Diemen's Land and the vast Wiradjuri nation of the state's central west. Both tragic events begun and administered by the colonial government of New South Wales and, in part, this House. I welcome the announcement from the Australian War Memorial Governing Council that they are moving towards a much broader, a much deeper depiction and presentation of frontier violence and the Black Wars. So today, as part of the process of truth-telling, I call on the New South Wales Government to likewise commit to establishing public memorials that acknowledge, educate and commemorate the reality of the Black Wars, the invasion, massacres, colonisation and dispossession, and the incredible suffering, injustices and resistance of First Nations peoples. The names and deeds of this nation's heroic warriors, Pemulwuy, Windradine, Malanagana, amongst others, must be recorded, displayed, celebrated and remembered in perpetuity, lest we forget. Mr. President, 2023 is another significant anniversary, an anniversary of significant change in this country. Fast forward 150 years from 1823 to 1973, 50 years ago. 1973 was a dynamic and dark time. The Cold War raged. The United States, defeated in Vietnam, signs the Paris Peace Accords and withdraws after 1.5 million war-related deaths, including 500 Australians. In Chile, President Salvador Allende is assassinated and the murderous tyrant General Pinochet seizes power in a CIA-backed coup d'etat. The Yom Kippur War precipitates the OPEC oil embargoes and inflation shocks that spiral the global economy into a decade-long recession. Ireland and London are racked by the troubles and murderous bombings. Nixon is impeached. In Durban, striking textile workers become unionised and begin the long march to freedom, dismantling the abhorrent apartheid regime. In Australia, the Aboriginal tent embassy starts. Gough Whitlam makes university free and after 100 years abolishes the racist white Australia policy. The United Tasmania Group formed, becoming the world's first environmental political party. We signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in protest at the madness of atmospheric nuclear tests by the French on Mururoa Atoll. Political turbulence manifested itself in the cultural and artistic zeitgeist too. Ziggy Stardust retired. Pink Floyd released Dark Side of the Moon. Bob Marley shoots the sheriff. DJ Kool Herc hosts the first hip-hop gig in NYC. Paul McCartney goes solo and is busted growing pot. Patrick White wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, and two great icons of Australian art and creative excellence emerge on the international stage, both within earshot of each other. The Sydney Opera House opens, and the boys from Burwood, AC/DC, perform their first gig at Checkers nightclub on Goulburn Street, Let There Be Rock. 1973, it was obviously all happening, and 50 years it is since Australia's counterculture revolution began with our very own Woodstock just up the Pacific Highway. The Aquarius Festival, the birth of the Australian hippie movement, held in Nimbin in the beautiful rainbow country of northern New South Wales, a gathering celebrating spiritual and ecological awakenings and the shared values of sustainability, peace, freedom, tolerance. An event credited with being the first that sought permission to use land from traditional owners and Australia's first Welcome to Country ceremony, Mr. President. Aquarius was part of a potent global social movement sceptical of authority that since the 1960s had grown in opposition to patriarchy, war, capitalism, consumerism, theocracy, imperialism and prohibition. A social movement fueled by the energy of a generation of young adventurers and students that turned their backs on suburban humdrum and explored a world without maps, that looked with curiosity at the myriad ways humans experience and perceive the world and themselves. They yearned to be free in body and mind, guided by philosophers and writers such as Bertrand Russell, John Paul Sartre, listening to the Beat generation of poets, thinkers and musicians. They experimented with cannabis and drugs. They turned on, tuned in and dropped out. As Kerouac said, I felt free, so I was free. Herbalism and the history of plants and as curatives and medicines, a history stretching back millennia, was rediscovered. They learnt that in the Atharvaveda, one of the 4 sacred texts of Hinduism, cannabis is named one of the most 5 sacred plants on earth and referred to as a source of happiness and a liberator. Dangerous, esoteric, revolutionary ideas and skills such as growing your own pot, composting, candle making, percolated and spread. Information and seeds were shared, along with the awareness that you could treat your pain and trauma, or that adults in the pursuit of happiness could lighten the load and trials of a sometimes difficult world for just a while with one of the most incredible and useful plants humans have ever domesticated and farmed, cannabis sativa. The Aquarius Festival, like so many around the world at that time, were celebrations of peace, love and equality, but were also a reaction and brave protest in the face of often violent political and cultural repression inflicted by hegemonies who were getting tough on drugs as part of cracking down on dissent from blacks, gays, civil libertarians, unions, environmentalists and feminists. Aquarius was an up yours to the man. It was the place where the movement to end prohibition and legalise cannabis began and remains anchored today. Into this milieu of social, political and cultural upheavals of 73, I was born, Generation X. My parents, Daniel and Rowena, had moved to Lutruwita, Tasmania, attracted by the pristine environment, country lifestyle, gothic romance and nascent bohemian cohort. Dad from South Sydney, mum from Nigeria via London. They were working class hippies, the resourceful recycler, renovator type. My dad was and remains as spiritual and new age as a brick. They fixed up old furniture and cars. lived by the maxim mend and make do, lived in old farmhouses with no power and little plumbing, kerosene lamps, candles, open fires. I remember simple rituals of connection, picking and preserving fruit, bonfires with friends and guitars, sawing and splitting wood, gardening. My parents would share Dad's homebrew and a spliff on the veranda with friends. Cannabis was part of the scene, but just a fragment of the patchwork. Later, living in Hobart, I went to the Hobart College, better known as THC. There was a lot of pot. Farmers' sons from the back blocks of Cygnet and Geeveston would turn up with duffel bags full of the stuff. It was coming out your ears and I inhaled. It seemed everybody was. Middle class, poorer, skaters, straights and gays, the surfers, footy heads, metalheads, a premier or two and goths. If you liked it, you did it, and if you didn't, you didn't. Freedom of choice. I mean, who here is going to put their hand up and say they didn't indulge at least once or twice in their misspent youth? No one. Thank you. Excellent. It was here in the 1990s that I came across the High Times magazines, Normal, and the massive cannabis culture of the US and Europe. I read Jack Herer's The Emperor Wears No Clothes on the history of cannabis and hemp and was convinced. At this juncture, I could read off 1,000 facts on the incredible benefits, industry and use of cannabis, but suffice to say it was clear to me that we have utilised cannabis for medicine, recreation, food, fibre, construction, and thousands of other uses for thousands of years, and we should do so again. I was amazed by the incredible hidden history of one of humanity's most useful resources and how it could be the solution to some of our most intractable problems. I wasn't alone. The Hemp for Paper Consortium, run by Democrat MLA Patsy Harmson, was arguing and campaigning for hemp as an alternative to native forest logging and paper production derived from wood chip and the destruction of the environment. It was an inspirational triple bottom line solution. I got involved, printed pamphlets, blundered through my first media interview on the ABC, set up an information stall at Salamanca and proselytised. Later at university, studying ecological agriculture, I gained a deeper understanding of hemp as an incredibly valuable and productive plant with untapped potential in crop rotations, disease control, water efficiency and carbon sequestration. But again and again I saw that its uptake would have to overcome the ridiculous regulatory brick wall of prohibitions on cannabis, despite the fact it effectively contained no drug in the form of psychoactive THC. What was in the way? Prohibition. As a student then and as an MP, I've had to study and grapple with the impacts of prohibition on our capacity to establish a hemp industry, a legal medicinal cannabis regime, and on social policy generally. As an MP, I launched a campaign to overcome ideological opposition to hemp seeds as foods and was successful in having them legalised. I thank the former member and minister, the Honourable Niall Blair, for his collaboration and successful efforts on that issue. But prohibition, easy to say and easy to sloganeer around. Just say no, zero tolerance. Prohibition, at its heart, is a victory of feelings over facts, a victory of panic over reason, a victory of simplicity over complexity, and a victory for anecdote over evidence. But the truth is, measured in treasure and unnecessary human suffering, prohibition would rate as one of the most tragic, costly, and counterproductive social policies in all human history. Humans have and always will use drugs as medicine and to enliven consciousness and arouse creativity. They can have a mild or powerful effect, be delightful or dangerous, and they can be used and abused, but they can and will ultimately be regulated and made safer. As responsible adults, we do it, and governments do it, with thousands of substances and medicines that save our lives, manage pain or improve the quality of our lives. Alcohol, ibuprofen, paracetamol, antihistamines, nicotine, opioids, benzodiazepines, Viagra and caffeine. Mr. President, at this point, I would like to note His Excellency, the Honourable Andrew Bell, the Lieutenant Governor of New South Wales, in his address to this House, encouraged us to take the most ubiquitous and useful of drugs, caffeine, when he said, and I quote, "The political life is not easy. It demands the highest standards of integrity. It calls daily for discernment and courage, and not a small amount of caffeine," end quote. I would like to remind His Excellency and this House that throughout history, some leaders have tried to prohibit coffee amongst other drugs and failed. Charles II thought that coffee houses were such dens of revolutionary subversion that he tried to destroy them. You must only investigate the seditious corners of Cafe Coram to know he was right. But that his attempt at prohibiting cappuccinos was doomed to failure, Charles III be warned. But I digress. Drug use is a complex issue that intersects biology, psychology, behaviour, culture, politics, and therefore demands a complex and nuanced public policy response. Prohibition is a blunt tool that has never worked, and it was never really meant to. Prohibition is a cunning perfidy, a fear-coloured lens used by the powerful to view an issue and build a narrative of intolerance, sow moral panic, so to position themselves as the solution. Theocracies, democracies, monarchies, and totalitarian dictatorships and their agencies all do it. A policy designed to maintain power, suppress disenfranchised and restless parts of society, and never about good public health policy. The war on drugs is really a war on ideas and reason. But where did it come from? The modern iteration, the USA, of course. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, formed to oversee the prohibition on alcohol in the 1920s, seamlessly rolled into enforcement of a new prohibition of cannabis when the alcohol ban was lifted in the early 1930s. The Bureau's chief, Harry J. Anslinger, cleverly used a complicit media and fabricated hysterical anecdotes laced with overt racism to build moral panic, political pressure, and his own gargantuan anti-drug empire. He served for 30 years in the role and constructed a labyrinth of legal and institutional obstacles to inhibit research and present the therapeutic use of this herb. He used his position and the US's enormous international influence to pressure other countries to follow their lead and sign anti-cannabis agreements and pass prohibition laws. Australia fell into line in 1938, not based on evidence but based on the ideological and corrupt interests of a nepotistic US agency. And who won? The villains did, because the war on drugs has become the war for drugs. The market remains, and where there is demand, there is supply. And prohibition has handed commercial supply and quality control over to the worst scumbags ever to walk the earth. The mafia, the Central and South American cartels, Pablo Escobar, Chapo Guzman, and here at home, Roger Rogerston, or the outlaw motorcycle gangs. There are state-based actors too. The North Korean regime and Myanmar's military junta are complicit in vast exports of illicit drugs. They are the ones that have and continue to make billions of dollars from illicit drug supply. And what do they do with their cash? Bad things. Arms dealing, slavery, extreme violence, regime change, murder and corruption, all funded by a business model handed to them by us. Who else won from the war for drugs? Big Pharma, multinational pharmaceutical corporations that flooded society with extremely addictive and damaging opioids. According to the Australian Institute of Criminology, the opioid crisis in Australia has resulted in increasing overdose death rates in both the United States and Canada and contributed to a decline in average US life expectancy. In 2017, there were 48,000 opioid-related overdose deaths and not a single one from cannabis. Despite stating that it has adopted an evidence-based approach to the current national drug strategy, neither mentions prohibition nor provides any evidence that prohibition is working, nor a defence of the dependence on deadly opioids. The strategy is based on the simplistic premise that prohibition, through law enforcement and border control activities, will diminish use and supply, so the market price on illicit drugs will increase, making them harder to procure. Under the New South Wales Drug Misuse and Trafficking Act 1985, the penalty for simple possessing any cannabis is a maximum 2-year jail sentence and $5,500 fine. Despite this, tens of thousands of mostly young or more commonly black people are being charged with possession every year. Importantly, for so many people, the first step they take into the gears of the criminal justice system and the path to incarceration. But draconian laws, helicopter raids and strike forces aren't making a dent. Just look at the evidence. In New South Wales and Australia, cannabis remains a cheap working class drug. 65% of people who use it share it and sell it between a network of friends. In 2016, 10.5% of Australians over the age of 14 had used cannabis in the last 12 months and 34.8% had used cannabis in their lifetime. The social cost of cannabis use was estimated to be $4.5 billion in 2016. More than half, 54%, or $24.4 billion of this cost was related to the criminal justice system, including imprisonment and administering community supervision orders, and those numbers are going up. It is madness to continue in this way when there is an alternative. The standard against which we should judge any law is whether some other set of laws would produce the same or better outcomes at lower financial and social cost. And there is. The majority of Australians support legalisation because they don't want their taxes wasted, their friends and families criminalised, and they are looking to superior models in other jurisdictions. Gallingly, the 31 US states, including California, New York, Nevada, Colorado and conservative Missouri, have legalised or decriminalised cannabis, with another 18 set to follow soon. Estimates are the market for medicinal, therapeutic and recreational cannabis sales in the US will soon be $50 billion per annum. Canada has legalised cannabis. In Ontario, a province with a population the size of New South Wales and Victoria combined, legalised cannabis sales are $3 billion per annum, and capital expenditure in the industry is running at $10 billion per annum. Germany, Spain, South Africa, Thailand and Mexico have all legalised cannabis, with scores more moving to decriminalisation. And what is the evidence from these jurisdictions? No significant increase in cannabis use, no psychosis epidemic, no mental health crisis, no crime wave, no epidemic of cannabis-related motor accidents. The ACT has, and now Queensland, are decriminalising all personal possession of illicit drugs. Medicinal cannabis was legalised across Australia in 2016. Hundreds of thousands of Australians have been prescribed and safely use an effective medicine that improves their lives every day. Who is benefiting from this use of medicinal cannabis most? Older women such as the late great Olivia Newton-John, a passionate advocate for cannabis. Sports stars too, Lauren Jackson and Andrew John, credit it with transforming their lives. Cannabis prohibition is coming to an end. Legalisation makes sense, and Australians know it. It's why they voted for us. It's not a matter of if, but when, and most importantly, how. And that is why I and my colleagues in the Legalise Cannabis Party in Western Australia and Victoria have been elected. With almost no budget, no advertising, no how to vote cards, simply passionate advocates for good ideas that need a singular specialist attention. To bring about the change that is 50 years overdue. To fix the broken RDT system and ensure medicinal cannabis users on the roads, in the workplace and in the community are not discriminated against. To make sure people can grow a few plants for adult use and share them without facing the threat of jail. We are a grassroots movement that has grown steadily, patiently and collaboratively, and this is the approach we will adopt in this place, to build trust, understanding and consensus. We will look for solutions to a lot of issues. We will put the health of community and our planet first, stopping CSG in our food bowl, acting on climate change and finding alternatives to cotton and the abuse of the Darling-Barker River will be a priority. Mr President, the future of the Murray-Darling Basin hangs in the balance. A decade of National Party water ministers in New South Wales and Canberra has left the rivers and the basin plan on the brink, and it is an issue for the Legalise Cannabis Party. We know climate change will dramatically reduce inflows across basin and catchments. Business as usual and water politics as usual will leave the rivers and communities more vulnerable than ever. It's time to deliver for the rivers. I will be making the basin a core element of my work in this place and look forward to working with the Water Minister Jackson and Premier Minns, who as a former Shadow Minister knows the issues well. Mr. President, Charles Bukowski said, censorship is the tool of those who Censorship is the tool of those who have the need to hide actualities from themselves and from others. The Legalise Cannabis Party will not self-censor. We will tell the difficult truth based on the evidence and viewing all issues through the prism of improving public health, social justice, civil liberty and environmental sustainability. For the point of power is maintaining the illusion there is something at the centre of it. If it is not freedom and compassion, then what? The people at the margins, the unemployed, the underemployed, vulnerable, the outsiders, the disabled and their carers, the sick and the dying. I commit to ensuring they will be at the centre of our thoughts and decision making. Mr. President, before I conclude, it is incumbent on me to acknowledge some of the relentless campaigners and activists who are at the heart and soul of the Legalise Cannabis movement and for drug law reform. Gail Hester. What a champion. A retired RN, a patient advocate who began reading the studies, news articles and success stories from patients in the US where people were using cannabis to treat all kinds of medical conditions, from depression, anxiety and pain to cancer. Losing her 21-year-old daughter Sarah to bowel cancer in 2008, she became angry her family had not been able to utilise cannabis. Gail contacted the Hemp Party and set up Facebook groups in every state and state and territory, which she called the Medical Cannabis Users Association of Australia, MCUA, which grew organically to 20,000 members and is the foundation of our party. The ever-affable Michael Balderstone, whose sage advice and tireless pursuit of cannabis law reform as a candidate for the Hemp Party and as the unofficial Mayor of Nimbin is an inspiration. David Helpburn, the Dean of Law at Southern Cross Unity, a former crusading magistrate and astute voice on drug law reform. To the organisations and individuals who have worked in this space for decades, like Gino Van Barker, Will Tregoni, Alex Wodak, the Pennington Institute, members of the Labor Party, and the Lambert Initiative, amongst so many others, I hope to be a useful ally. Lucy Haslam, whose passionate advocacy has changed attitudes, laws and the country. Craig Ellis, the Legalise Cannabis chairman, whose incredible energy and organisational skills got the party registered and our ship in order. To my former colleagues and comrades in the Greens, Kate Fairman and David Shoebridge, I particularly thank them for their recent campaigns to legalise cannabis, which did so much to raise the issue, boost our membership and get me elected. Thanks, Dave. Your efforts will not be forgotten. To my friends and supporters, David Quince, Rob McBride, Nick and Sandra Fairfax, Alex Turnbull, Rod Keldoulis, Sue and John McKinnon, Bob Brown, Paul Thomas, Dawn and Mike, Jan Barham, Max and Claire, Sandra Helpburn, Jack and Em, Captain Justin Field, Louise Calloway, thanks for being there. I nearly got there. Finally, to my family, Tam for lifting me up, Mum and Paul, Dan, Horry and Rose. My brave and darling wife Crystal has been there through thick and thin. To our beautiful children, who I'm so very proud of, Sienna, Coco, James and Eden. I love you all so much. Thank you.